Welcome to the video review of the first Legends of Runeterra balance patch since its full release on April 30th. After looking at feedback from my previous patch reviews, I've decided to change up the format a bit. In this video, I'll only be reviewing the card changes and what's on the watch list. I'll very briefly touch on the developer notes, but I won't be reviewing the expedition changes or the bug fixes. So feel free to check out those changes in the patch notes themselves. I'll leave a link in the video description to that. And let me know if you like this format better by liking the video and leaving a comment. As usual, I'll have timestamps in the video description and as a pinned comment below for anyone that wants to skip to specific cards. I've got quite a bit to say on some of these changes, so let's jump into it. As always, the patch notes open up with some notes from the Legends of Runeterra developers and a reminder that the team is still continuing to patch on Tuesday, but we now won't see the changes until Wednesday going forward, as opposed to seeing them Tuesday during open beta. There's a brief note about a video from the team where they'll be sharing some details about what's coming up next for Legends of Runeterra this Friday, May 29th at 10 a.m. Pacific on their YouTube channel. So mark your calendars and set your reminders. The rest is just reviewing what their approach is to balancing cards for any new players to the game. So if you're new, I encourage you to read up on their approach in the patch notes. Again, the link will be in the video description. Now, on to the actual card changes, starting with the champions. First up is Vladimir, whose level 2 now states that he drains 1 from the enemy Nexus for each other attacking ally instead of just dealing 1. This is a solid change. While I don't think this will ultimately increase Vladimir's play rate a ton, I do think this makes his level 2 a little more worth it, if you will. Vladimir has always been easy to level up in the decks that supported him, but as someone who's messed with Vladimir on several occasions throughout open beta, a lot of times it felt like his level 2 wasn't much better than his level 1. So draining now makes Vladimir feel more like an actual level 2 champion, rather than something that's an afterthought. Also, this makes him better against aggro decks, since you can gain back some of the health you lost in the early game. Next is Karma, who now costs 6 mana to play instead of 5 mana. I wish I could say that this change will finally bring Karma down to earth as a more fair late game win condition for control decks that want to win through attrition, but it's not. For those new, I did a video during open beta explaining why Karma's level 2 is overpowered and why she needed to be nerfed, so I won't go into detail here. I'll just leave a card on the top right corner of this video that you can click on if you want to watch that one. I'll just say that this mana cost increase does very little to impact her play rate because of the way Karma is played. Good players almost never play Karma before round 9 of any game. The only time they would is if they know their opponent can't remove Karma. The decision to play Karma before round 9 is based on whether or not they have the cards in hand to protect Karma and their opponent's remaining mana on the particular turn they want to play her. I could see this affecting how much mana Karma players will need to hold up if they do decide to play her on round 9. Like for example, if you want to have mana to play a Deny or Will of Ionia to protect Karma on round 9 when you play her, you now need 1 spell mana, meaning you need to save at least 1 mana from round 8 to do so. But that's not hard to do for control decks in general, since they have mana left over all the time. So this change pretty much does nothing to bring down Karma's play rate. Karma players will simply make the slight adjustments they're required to make. She'll still be the dominant card that forces mid-range decks to be able to end the game before round 10, and continue to literally invalidate any other control deck in the game right now, since they'll never be able to outvalue a level 2 Karma once it's round 10. There needs to be a much more significant change. Karma costing 5 mana wasn't the reason Karma decks were getting banned in tournaments, and she will continue to be banned until her level 2 ability is changed. Up next is Shen, whose level 1 now has 3 power, which is up from 2 power, and consequently his level 2 now has 4 power, which is up from 3 power. I love this change. I think this will be similar to Vladimir in the sense that Shen won't see a huge increase in play rate, but despite Shen having a lot of health for a 4-drop, 2 power felt really underwhelming, especially on a champion whose ability relies on him attacking. There were a ton of situations where I've wanted to attack with Shen to give an important unit barrier, like Fiora, but I knew he would just take a bunch of damage at level 1 since 2 power usually wasn't enough to kill anything significant. He just wasn't very threatening, and I always had to treat him like a punching bag when I played him. This change, like Riot stated in the patch notes, will make attacks that you plan out more profitable because they certainly didn't feel that way before. Next we have Vi, whose level 1 now has 4 health, which is down from 5 health, and her level 2 now has 5 health, which is down from 6 health. Vi being nerfed was not a surprise, as she was seeing a ton of use in multiple Piltover and Zaun decks. It got to the point where even Bannerman decks would play Vi as their only Piltover and Zaun card because she was better than any of the other 5-drops you could play, aside from Radiant Guardian anyway. She was just the best in slot champion for a lot of decks, and it felt like she was ending up in region combinations she normally should have no business in because she was so good. My issue is that a health nerf might potentially be a bit too much. I'm not sure how to feel about it. On one hand, it definitely means she doesn't dominate boards as much, which I like. On the other hand, 4 health, even with tough, might mean she has no impact at all, and your opponent won't care about Vi when she is played. Some people might think this will be the end of Karina control, but I personally don't think so. I think this just marks the end of Vi Bannerman decks, and Demacia has plenty of 5-drops they can choose from, so this is not a big deal for them. Riot did state that they wanted Vi to be more specialized with this change, and I think she will be going forward. And the final champion on this list is Hecarim, whose level 1 now has 5 power, which is up from 4 power, and his level 2 now has 6 power, which is up from 5 power. This kinda felt needed. I know some players from open beta still have scars from when Hecarim dominated the meta for a time, before the age of Karma Ezreal took over. But ever since this guy went from 6 health to 5 health, he's basically seen no play in the higher parts of ranked ladder. It's easy enough to see why. Every time I've experimented with Hecarim since his initial nerf, he felt super bad when he couldn't even trade with the other popular 5-drops as a 4-5. Granted, he still dies to them now as a 5-5, and there are still some he can't trade with, but he should feel a bit more threatening now. Hecarim is at his best when he's actually able to attack, and a 4-5 stat line really didn't allow him to do that in this meta. He has felt better in more recent testing, and we'll need to see how the meta shifts, but I think he has potential to make an impact again depending on certain factors, even if certain 5-mana units remain popular. Moving on to the followers and spells that got changed, we're starting with Greathorn Companion, who is now a 5-5, up from being a 4-5. This is a really scary change. I've always said the one thing holding this card back was the fact that it only had 4 power as a 5-cost unit. Granted, that is because it has Scout, so a trade-off has to be made somewhere. But now I think Greathorn Companion is a serious contender for Demacia mid-range decks that want to be more aggressive. Think Scout decks, or as I like to call them, Bannerman Scouts, or Banner Scouts, if you will. In fact, if the meta slows down, I think Demacia will be forced to build their mid-range decks a bit more aggressively, and it won't just pertain to Scouts. It's something we saw already with Vi Bannerman decks lowering their mana curve and running more 1-drops like Cithria of Cloudfield to combat burn aggro and be fast enough to do better against Karma decks. So we might see that trend continue in other Demacia decks, even if Vi Bannerman takes the fall. The one deck we won't see that trend in is Karma Lux, who indirectly got buffed from this change, as Greathorn Companion is one of the units you can pull from Remembrance. Don't get me wrong, Greathorn still has a lot of competition at the 5-mana slot, but there's definitely a lot more potential here. Next up is Grizzled Ranger, who is now a 3-1, down from being a 4-1. Despite the main complaint of this card being its Scout and Last Breath abilities, I think this is a good change. Ranger continues to be a sticky option that Demacia can use to help fight Shadow Owl's control decks in the late game. But now you can't just swing in freely with this card and expect it to take out anything your opponent blocks with on round 4. Or potentially get 8 damage out of this card, which I think was the more impactful thing about it. He doesn't trade with the loyal Badgerbear he makes anymore either, which is the next card we'll be talking about. I don't think Ranger is necessarily unplayable now, but it's going to be very interesting seeing how players react to this nerf in the next few weeks. Maybe since Grizzled Ranger no longer trades with loyal Badgerbear, he's no longer worth it. Or maybe he's still worth playing because he makes a loyal Badgerbear when he dies, even if he dies to another Badgerbear, since that opposing Badgerbear will be weaker and will die to yours. Regardless, anyone facing this card definitely has more breathing room now as far as how they want to handle it. Up next, we have Loyal Badgerbear, who is now a 3/4, down from being a 4/4. This was the change I was hoping for, as I think if this got changed to a 4/3, it would basically invalidate Loyal Badgerbear as a competitive 3-mana unit. There'd just be too many cheap units that would trade with him. As a 3/4, Badgerbear is still solid. At one point during open beta, a unit with this stat line would have absolutely dominated the game, and I think still makes an impact now. I don't expect Badgerbear to drop significantly in play because of this. It may even see the same amount of play it does now. There aren't any 1v1 scenarios that change with this new stat line. Badgerbear still kills the popular cheaper units that it did before for free, and still dies to the more expensive units that were in the meta without trading with them. There are two specific scenarios where this nerf hurts. If a 3/3 is blocking Badgerbear and is buffed by Radiant Strike, the 3/3 kills Badgerbear and lives. The other scenario is that Badgerbear no longer trades up against Swiftwing Lancer, which was honestly a pet peeve of mine. Next, we have Laurent Chevalier, who is now a 3/2, up from being a 3/1. This is a nice buff. Again, like other cards in this patch that were buffed, I don't think this will change Chevalier's play rate significantly, since he's still outclassed by Demasia's other 4-mana options. But Chevalier has always been a pet card of mine. This buff means you can get extra value out of Chevalier by challenging 1/1 units like Warden's Prey or random spider tokens that aren't buffed yet. Also, he now dodges ping damage from stuff like Vile Feast and Static Shock. Again, a nice change, but it'll remain to be seen if it'll be enough. Next, we have Standalone, which now costs 4 mana, up from 3 mana. I think this nerf marks the end of the OTK Standalone deck. Now they can't wait until turn 3 to play a unit, and use Standalone on that unit in the same turn anymore. I do agree with Riot that the deck created game states where it forced the opponent to have a specific answer, otherwise they would lose. And at times, even if they did have the answer, the deck often had ways to counter it and protect the unit they buffed. But on the other hand, the deck also fell flat on its face just as often. When the Standalone deck loses, it loses hard. I'm pretty indifferent on this one. I wasn't a huge fan of the Standalone deck, since it was hard for me to consider it a real combo deck, despite the deck having all the weaknesses of a combo deck. And most of the time, it was very rare when the deck could actually one-turn kill anyone. Standalone has always been one of those cards where you love it when it's in your hand and activated, and you hate it when it's either a dead card in your hand or you're the one facing a Standalone buffed unit with no real answer to it. Maybe it's still worth it in other decks, but I doubt it. I was never a fan of more unit heavy decks running this card either, since too often it was, in fact, a dead card. Anyway, I don't have seething hate for this card, but I'll be fine if it never comes back. Up next, we have Legion Rearguard, who is now a 3/1, down from being a 3/2. This nerf is weird to me because I feel like this isn't as big of a change as others seem to make it out to be. Granted, this nerf now makes Rearguard awkward and just less good on turn 1 in general. Every 1-drop in the game kills him now, and he also dies to ping effects. But there were already some fairly common scenarios where Rearguard just felt awkward anyway, even as a 3/2, and I'd say he was almost unplayable after turn 1, unless you either had an insanely good opening hand or your opponent had a bad hand. Other decks could even take advantage of the fact that he couldn't block. From a design perspective though, I feel like this nerf is fair. 5 total stats for 1 mana was still way too much, and despite what I just talked about, the cost of not being able to block wasn't enough to balance those stats out. Riot did state that the win rate for burn aggro went up significantly when played on round 1, although I would argue any of their 1-drops had a similar effect depending on the matchup. Rearguard just forced you to play him first on turn 1 over any of your other 1-drops because he ended up being your worst 1-drop pretty often after that. I'm not mad at this change. I just think it's weird going off of my own experiences playing this card, that's all. Next we have Kindly Tavernkeeper, who is now a 3/3, up from being a 2/3. Not much to say on this one, but it is nice to see that in the patch notes, Riot did acknowledge that healing is actually part of Freljord's regional identity. I think this makes Tavernkeeper much more appealing now, since personally, I thought he was nearly unplayable as a 2/3, even as a flex slot. What I do want to see is Freljord get more healing cards, as the good healing they have access to pales in comparison to Shadow Isles, and I would even argue Ionia. Hopefully we see that in future sets. Next we have Deep Meditation, which now costs 5 mana, up from 4 mana. This is another card I'm split on, only because on the one hand I absolutely love this card, but on the other hand it was absolutely busted in certain decks, particularly any deck using Karma. I think it will still see use in spell-based strategies, whether they use Karma or not, especially if the other region they're running doesn't give them access to better card draw, which is the case most of the time when pairing Ionia with something else. What I'm curious to see though is whether or not it'll still be worth it to run 3 copies. I'm leaning towards yes in those spell-based decks I just mentioned, but I think other decks that simply use this as a draw effect to get to specific spells will probably trim this card down to 1 or 2 copies, if they decide to still run it at all. Heimerdinger gets indirectly buffed by this though, since this costs 3 mana now once fully activated, meaning more elusive turrets. Next we have Boomcrew Rookie, who is now a 1/3 instead of a 1/4. This was one of 2 possible nerfs I was afraid of, the other one being Boomcrew reverting back to a 0/4. I'm still of the belief that any nerf to Boomcrew's stat line potentially makes him unplayable, but I'm not surprised to see this nerf, and it is the lesser of 2 evils between this and a revert. Actually going back to it being a 0/4 would definitely make him unplayable, since he saw no play back when that was his stat line in open beta. I think Boomcrew is too easily removed now, and I was actually hoping for a nerf to his ability, but this is what we get instead. I think in the short term, burn aggro decks will keep playing this card, expecting the same results, since they usually didn't care if Boomcrew actually died. But in the long run, he'll die too often due to this change, and those same burn aggro decks will be looking for another 2-drop to play. Maybe I'm wrong though, we'll see. Next we have Brood Awakening, which now costs 6 mana, up from 5 mana. Not much to say, as this is a revert back to Brood Awakening's original cost. Similar to Vi, Brood Awakening at 5 mana made the Elise Spider package extremely flexible, and because of that, this card, along with the other cards in that package, saw play in several different Shadow Isles decks that weren't focused on the Spider tag, but simply wanted to use Elise and Spider tokens as a defensive tool to control the game until their win conditions came online later. Now with Brood back at 6 mana, the Spider package in general will likely go back to just being in its own specific Spider tribal deck, and Brood Awakening itself will probably go back to seeing almost no play, just like it did before its cost was reduced. Next we have Longtooth, who is now a 5/2 up from being a 5/1. To be clear, this is a card that's only generated from the card Chum the Waters. Chum the Waters itself has seen almost no play in ranked, so this is a nice change. However, the buff will probably affect Expedition more than ranked. It is nice that you no longer need an enemy unit to be in play in order to play this card, but Riot did confirm that was actually a bug, and the card was always intended to work that way. Next we have Monkey Idol, who is now a 0/5 up from being a 0/4. This is a welcome change, as this now means Monkey Idol has the potential to create 3 powder monkeys now, instead of just 2 before dying. I really would love to see this card in a competitive deck, and I'm hoping a strong deck builder can make it happen. Because up until this point, we haven't seen this card in ranked pretty much ever. But that's all I really have to say about this card. It's just a very interesting card, for sure. And the final change is Slotbot, who is now a 1/4 up from being a 0/3. I think this is actually huge for Slotbot. It's gone from being a unit that's a little too easy to remove to something that's much tougher to kill with just 1 card. 4 health is a premium stat in Legends of Runeterra, because a 4 health unit dodges a ton of the removal that would kill a 3 health unit in this game. 5 is even more premium, but the difference between 4 and 5 isn't as big. Anyway, Slotbot's ability still kind of makes it a meme card, so I don't expect to see it in serious decks, but it's definitely a lot of fun. On to the watch list, and this time around we've got several cards and even some mechanics being monitored. Starting with probably the most controversial one on this list, Unyielding Spirit. A lot of players, myself included, wanted this card nerfed in this patch, but unfortunately that didn't happen. I do agree with Riot that a quick numbers change could make this card unplayable. Even going from 8 mana to 9 mana is a huge nerf. But this is a dangerous effect in general. I feel like this card was made to get players to use very specific cards that don't see a lot of play otherwise. These are cards that remove units in other ways outside of just damaging or killing them, the 2 most common ways to remove units in this game. The only effects that get rid of an Unyielding Spirit unit are Obliterate, capturing the unit, shuffling the unit back into their deck, removing its text, and recalling that unit. Out of all of those effects, the only common one used is recall via Will of Ionia. The other cards range from being specific to its own deck to downright awkward. We're talking stuff from Devourer of the Depths and Nautilus's Riptide spell, all the way to Purify and Detain, with other things in between like She Who Wanders. I do think Purify and Detain are underrated, but I'd be lying if I said they weren't awkward at times. Anyway, my big issue with this card is that it's often used on champions, which negates Purify and She Who Wanders as answers, making counterplay even more limited. I'm with a lot of other people in the community that suggested this card get downgraded to a fast spell, so hopefully that happens and that it doesn't make the card unplayable. So pilfered goods and card stealing in general are also on the watch list. I personally have mixed feelings about this mechanic as a whole. I am of the unpopular opinion that the card stealing package of pilfered goods and black market merchant, at least from a consistency standpoint, isn't nearly as good as people think, and that it's highly overrated. It's very RNG dependent, and you have to hope that the opposing deck is weak to its own cards, while also hoping that your deck can actually utilize the cards you stole to good enough effect. I don't even think pilfered goods gives you the same card advantage as other cards in the game do from a quality standpoint, even with the mana cost reduction. Recent meta reports even showed the Kleptomancy decks dropping to lower tier status. However, I do still think something needs to happen to these. Even if these cards aren't necessarily good, they are way too swingy. They do actively punish certain deck building strategies, like running single copies of a certain card, but they can create too many feel bad moments, meaning when these cards are good, they're really good. I've personally gone from consistently beating Kleptomancy decks with literally any deck I play to losing to them consistently just based on what they stole. They're particularly good against control decks. Now, while I do think there needs to be an adjustment, I don't know what that adjustment looks like. Maybe make it to where the card stolen will always be shown in the opponent's hand. This is actually how Sleight of Hand works, one of my favorite cards from this expansion, so I'm not sure why it isn't the same for pilfered goods and black market merchant. Another, let's say, mechanic on the watch list is Nexus damage and Rising Tides. So this is something that Riot is just monitoring in general. They and several content creators knew that with the release of Rising Tides, there would be an uptick in effects that dealt direct damage to the Nexus in the meta due to the nature of many of the cards in the expansion, particularly from Bilgewater. Some adjustments were already made to that in this patch via some of the nerfs we talked about, but they'll just continue to monitor things in case more changes need to be made. And the final 2 cards on the watch list are Karma and Ezreal. These 2 were actually on the previous watch list, so I won't spend too much time on them here. The Karma Ezreal deck itself that dominated the final weeks of open beta has fallen off, but Karma in particular has still found a lot of success in other decks, which is no surprise to me. Again, I've already done a video dedicated entirely to the problem with karma. Ezreal hasn't been so lucky though. Anyway, I'm glad they'll continue to monitor these two. They did increase Karma's mana cost in this patch, but I and many others suspect this will do basically nothing to reduce her popularity, as all of her power has everything to do with her level 2 ability, not how much she costs. And that's it from me. The rest of the changes are for Expedition and some additional cosmetics. So again, feel free to check out the patch notes on those in the link in the video description below. If you guys made it to the end, thank you so much for the support. If you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting the like button below and leaving a comment. I appreciate constructive criticism and feedback, since I'm always looking to do things better. If you don't want to miss out on future videos, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to click the notification bell below as well. Also, feel free to check out all the other social media places I hang out at. I do stream Legends of Runeterra live on Twitch, so feel free to follow me there as well. Links to everything are in the video description below. Thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all next time. Take care.